He fell off the stage before it had even stopped rolling, and the men loafing outside the mercantile at hardscrabble laughed the way men laugh at another man's ruin, until Josephine Hart pushed through them and saw who it was, and the laughter died in her throat before it ever reached her mouth. Levy. He looked up at her from the dust of the street, and for a moment she did not recognize him at all. The broad-shouldered young man who had ridden off to war 4 years ago, replaced by something gaunt and hollow-eyed, his uniform coat gone grey with travel and worse. A bottle still clutched in one hand even as he tried to right himself. He smelled of whiskey and horse and something else underneath that she did not have a name for yet, something like a wound that had never properly closed. Josie. His voice cracked on her name, and he would not meet her eyes. You oughtn't have come. I wrote and told your father not to send word. He didn't send word. I heard the stage was in and I came anyway, same as I've come to meet every stage for 4 years. She knelt in the dust in front of the whole gawking street and took his face in her 2 hands. And if the town wanted to watch a ruined man be loved by a woman who wasn't ashamed to love him in public, she would give them a good long look at it. Get up, Levy Sowards. You're coming home. He tried to refuse her 3 times on the walk to the wagon. Told her plainly that the man she'd promised herself to at 19 had not come back from that war. That what had come back instead wasn't fit to sit at her table, let alone stand at an altar with her. That she should go on and marry some whole man while she still had the chance. Josie listened to every word of it without flinching, and when he was done, she said only, I didn't ask what came back. I asked you to get in the wagon, and drove him the 6 miles out to the homestead near Hardscrabble with his head lolling against the seat rail and her own heart breaking quiet and private where he couldn't see it. They had been sweethearts since she was 16 and he 18. Levy teaching her to sit a horse properly and Josie teaching him his letters better than the schoolhouse ever had, and by the time he asked her to marry him under the cottonwood by Miller's Creek, the whole county had already assumed it was settled between them. He had ridden off to war 3 weeks after the asking, promising her a wedding the day he came home, and Josie had spent 4 years believing, with the stubborn faith of a woman who had chosen once and did not choose twice, that the promise still held even when his letters grew shorter and then, in the last year, stopped coming at all. The house he came back to was the same one they'd have shared as husband and wife if the war hadn't come. Josie had kept it up herself these 4 years. Working the small acreage with hired help in season, refusing every man who'd come sniffing around a woman alone with land, because she had promised Levy Sowards she would wait, and Josephine Hart was not a woman who broke her word for convenience. She was not, however, prepared for how badly the war had broken him. The bottle in his hand at the stage was not the last one. Within the week she had found 6 more hidden about the house and barn, under the porch boards, behind the flour bin, tucked into the hay in the loft where he slept because he said he could not yet bear a proper bed. He drank not for pleasure but for silence, she came to understand, drank to keep down whatever moved behind his eyes at night that made him wake shouting words she didn't understand, names of men she'd never met, orders barked into an empty room as if the war never let go of him and never would. Leave it be, Josie, he told her the first time she found a bottle and poured it out the kitchen window. His voice had gone hard, a stranger's voice. You don't know what you're pouring out. You don't know what I need to get through a night. I know what pouring it into you is doing instead of what you think it's doing, she said, steady, refusing the fight he seemed to want. I watched my own father drink himself into an early grave trying to outrun grief, Levy. I know the shape of it. I'm not going to pretend I don't see it because it frightens me to look at. Then maybe you ought to be frightened enough to leave. I buried a mother young and a father to drink, and I am still standing in this kitchen, Josie said, and for the first time her voice shook, not with anger but with a grief of her own that she rarely let show. I am not leaving you, Levy Sowards. You can drink every bottle in the territory, and I will pour out every one of them after you, for as many nights as it takes, because I did not wait 4 years for a memory of you. I waited for you. He did not answer that. He walked out to the barn and did not come to supper, and Josie sat alone at the table they were supposed to share as man and wife and let herself cry, hard, into her apron, before she wiped her face, banked the fire, and went to bed alone in a house that was supposed to be full. It did not get easier quickly, There were nights he raged at shadows only he could see, nights he wept without being able to say why, nights he begged her in a small broken voice to just let him be, that he wasn't worth the fight she kept putting up. There were mornings he was so ashamed of the night before that he could not look at her across the table, mornings he apologized in a voice scraped raw, with self-loathing that cut her worse than any anger could have. Josie never once shamed him for any of it. She had learned, watching her father, that shame only drove a wounded man deeper into the bottle, gave him one more reason to believe he deserved the ruin he was drowning in. Instead, she met him, night after night, with the same steady, unshakable presence, sitting up with him when the dreams came, making him tea instead of coffee so his hands had something warm to hold that wasn't liquor, telling him plainly and often that what happened to him in that war was not his failing, that a man could be broken by cannon fire and grief the same as a bone could be broken by a fall, and that broken bones mended crooked only when nobody set them right. The town did not make it easy on her. Word got around hardscrabble quick, the way word always did, and there were women at church who drew their skirts a little tighter when Josie passed, murmuring that a decent woman oughtn't tie herself to a drunkard, that Levi Sowards had plainly gone to ruin and taken his good name with him. Old Mrs. Pruitt cornered her outright after service one Sunday, remarking loud enough for 3 pews to hear that it was a shame to see a fine young woman waste her prospects on a man who couldn't hold his liquor. He held a rifle for 4 years so men like your husband could sleep safe in their beds, Josie said, not raising her voice, not needing to. If hardscrabble has forgotten what that cost him, I haven't. And I'll thank the town to keep its pity for someone who wants it. She walked out with her head high and did not go back to that particular pew again, choosing instead to sit in back where she could leave quick if Levi needed her, and if the town wanted to whisper, she decided. It could whisper about a woman who loved fiercely rather than one who loved carefully. She had never much cared for careful. At home the fight was quieter but no less constant. There came a night in high summer when Levi, 3 sleepless nights deep and raw as an open wound, hurled a glass against the wall and shouted at her to leave him be, that he was tired of being watched like a man expected to break, that she deserved better than standing guard over him like a nursemaid over an invalid. I am not standing guard over an invalid, Josie said, sweeping up the glass without flinching at his temper, because she had learned by then that his anger was fear wearing a rougher coat. I am standing beside a man I love while he fights something that very near killed him. There's a difference, Levi, and I'll thank you to see it because I surely do. He had no answer for that either, only turned away with his shoulders shaking, and Josie set down the broom and simply put her arms around him from behind, saying nothing more, letting her steadiness do the talking her words could not, until his breathing slowed and the worst of the night passed. Talk to me, she told him one night in early autumn, when he'd gone 3 days without a drop and looked wrung out and raw from the effort of it, sitting on the porch step with his hands shaking around a cup of tea he could barely hold steady. Not the parts you think I can't bear to hear. All of it. I've buried a mother and a father already, Levi. I am not made of glass. So he talked, haltingly in pieces that did not always make sense, about a ravine where half his company had gone down and not come up, about a boy no older than 16 who had with his hand in Levi's and asked him to write his mother a letter Levi still had never been able to write, about the particular silence of a battlefield after the guns stopped, worse somehow than the guns themselves. He told her about the sound cannon fire left behind long after the cannons had gone quiet, how thunder now arrived in his ears as something else entirely, how he had learned to flinch at sounds no other man in a room seemed to notice at all, and how ashamed that flinching made him feel in front of people who had not seen what he had seen. Josie sat beside him and did not flinch and did not look away and did not once tell him it would be all right, because she understood, with an instinct deeper than anything she'd been taught, that what he needed was not comfort but witness, someone willing to stand in the dark with him and not run from what she saw there. Thank you, he said, when he'd talked himself hoarse and the porch had gone dark around them, for not looking at me like the men in town look at me. How do they look at you? Like I'm something that ought to be handled careful, or else is something already broken past mending. He turned the empty teacup in his hands. You've never once looked at me like either. That's because you're neither, Josie said simply. You're a man who went through something terrible and came home carrying it. That's not the same as being ruined, Levy, whatever the bottle's been telling you. It was 3 weeks later, in the black heart of an autumn storm, that everything came to its reckoning. Thunder had been rolling since sundown, close and hard, cracking overhead with a violence that shook the window panes, and Josie had noticed Levy go quiet and strange over supper, his eyes fixed on nothing, his hands trembling around his fork until he set it down and simply stopped eating altogether. She recognized the look now, had learned it the hard way over these long months, and she was reaching for his hand across the table when the loudest crack of thunder yet split the sky directly overhead, and Levy Sowards was no longer in a kitchen near Hardscrabble at all. He was back in the ravine. He came up out of his chair so fast it went over backward, shouting orders to men who were 4 years dead and 1,000 miles away, and before Josie could reach him he was out the door and into the storm. Running blind across the yard toward the old well at the property's edge, the one with the rotted cover Levy himself had been meaning to repair before the flashback took every ounce of sense clean out of him. Levy. Josie was after him in an instant, bare feet in the mud, rain lashing sideways, lightning throwing the whole yard into stark white flashes and black nothing between them. Levy, stop, it's Josie. You're home. You're at Hardscrabble. There's no ravine here, do you hear me? He didn't hear her. He was shouting a name. Danny, the boy from the letter he'd never written, reaching for a hand that wasn't there, stumbling straight to the black mouth of the well with its rotted planking. And Josie put on a burst of speed that came from someplace beyond her own strength and caught his arm 3 strides from the edge, hauling back with everything in her narrow frame, and the two of them went down together into the mud hard, her body between his and the drop. Her arms locked around him as thunder cracked again overhead, and he fought her blind for one terrible, endless moment that felt like it might cost them both everything. I've got you, she said into his ear over and over, not letting go no matter how he thrashed, rain running into her mouth as she spoke. I've got you, Levy. You're not there. You're here. You're with me. I am not letting go. I am not leaving. I have got you and I am not letting go. Something in the litany finally reached him, her voice not the storms, her arms not the ravine, and all at once the fight went out of him entirely, and he collapsed against her in the mud, shaking, sobbing in a way she had never once heard a grown man cry. 4 years of war and grief and shame breaking loose all at once in the rain, and Josie held him through all of it, soaked to the bone, her own tears mixing with the storm, until the shaking finally eased and the thunder rolled on past them toward the hills. I could have hurt you, he said afterward, hoarse, when she'd gotten them both inside and wrapped in blankets before the fire, his voice raw with a horror that went beyond the storm. I could have, Josie. I was somewhere else. I didn't even know you were there. But I was there, she said simply, taking his shaking hands in hers, and I will be there. Every time it happens, for as long as it takes, I will be there, because that is what I promised you, Levy, and I don't make promises I don't intend to keep. She pressed his hand to her chest, over her own steady heartbeat. You are not ruined. You are wounded, and wounds heal, slow and ugly and crooked sometimes, but they heal if somebody stays long enough to let them. He looked at her for a long moment in the firelight, this woman who had poured out a dozen bottles and never once poured out her patience, who had pulled him back bodily from the edge of a well and further than that, from the edge of himself, and something in his face that had been locked shut since the war finally, quietly opened. I don't know how to be the man I was, he said. I don't want the man you were, Josie told him, and meant it with her whole battered, faithful heart. I want the man you are, Levy Sowards, drink poured out and all, dreams and all, every broken piece of you. I have wanted him since I was 19 years old, and I have not stopped wanting him for one single day since. Stay. Let me love you through the rest of it. Winter came to the homestead near Hardscrabble, and then a slow, hard-won spring, and there were setbacks in it, nights that tried them both. But there were no more hidden bottles, no more shame-soaked mornings, only the steady work of two people rebuilding something together out of what the war had left behind. On a clear morning in April, in the yard where he had once nearly run himself to ruin, Levy Sowards took Josephine Hart's hands in his own steady ones, steady for the first time in 4 years, at last to be his wife in truth as well as in promise. I told the whole street I was taking you home the day you got off that stage, Joe said, laughing through the tears that came easy and glad now instead of grieving. Seems only right to finish what I started. You saved my life that night in the storm, Levy said, and every night before it, and I mean to spend the rest of mine proving I was worth the saving. You already have, Josie said, and kissed him there in the spring sunlight, in the yard of the home they had both, in their own hard way, fought to keep. They were married the following month under the same cottonwood by Miller's Creek, where he had first asked her at 18, the whole of Hardscrabble turning out to see it, even Mrs. Pruitt, who brought a pie and said nothing more about wasted prospects. Levi still had hard nights in the years that followed. Storms still cost him something, certain sounds still pulled at old wounds. But he never drank to outrun them again, and he never faced one of them alone, because Josephine Sowards had meant every word of her promise, and a promise kept, she liked to say, was the sturdiest thing two people could build a life on,